Today I'm speaking with the investigative journalist Asa Winstanley. He reports for the Electronic Intifada. He also has his own substack, and he's an award-winning author. His recent book, Weaponizing Anti-Semitism, is a bestseller online. We'll include links for you to take a look at some of his work and support his work. Asa, it's a pleasure to have you today on the show.
It's great to be with you, Ahmed.
So, Asa, I wanted to talk about the recent developments in Gaza. Obviously, the genocide is ongoing, and the Israelis are now heavily attacking Gaza City, and it just seems like there is no end in sight. What is your current assessment of the situation in Gaza, and where do you think this could be going next?
Well, the genocide continues. The genocide has been going on now for nearly 2 years as we film this. Beginning of September 2025, and it's an active genocide. It's the Israelis have been targeting the entire civilian population, the entire population for 2 years, and this is the latest phase of it. The Israelis have been trying to take Gaza City really for 2 years. So how many times have they said that? For example, Beit Hanun in the northern Gaza Strip, that they took that. I believe it's around 5 or 6 times that they've said that they've successfully cleared it and defeated the Beit Hanun battalion of the Izzuddin Qassam brigades, the armed wing of Hamas. They've stated on multiple occasions that they've taken Beit Hanun, and yet Hamas seems to just keep coming back. And so, there's no doubt that they can kill Palestinian civilians, but the reality is that the Palestinian resistance fighters keep coming back. Like, they're still fighting after 2 years. That alone is a massive existential crisis for Israel. It's an existential crisis for the Israeli military. We see reports constantly in the Israeli press warning about the collapse of the Israeli army, because there's a phenomenon now of refusal to actually return. The later in terms of the Israeli reservists returning to report to fight in Gaza, and it's not a moral refusal. They're not refusing because of any kind of scruples of carrying out the genocide. They're very happy to do that, but it's simply a kind of collapse, a kind of collapse of the Israeli military that seems to be happening. So we'll see. We'll see how successful they are in taking Gaza City, as they aim to do.
So, in your view, why is it that Israel is struggling to take out Gaza City or to defeat the resistance forces? As you mentioned, they claim they took Beit Hanun several times. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. That's how many people have described it. Is it the tunnel system that is still intact? Is it just the method that they decentralize manner of organizing themselves? Why is it that the Israelis are struggling, or are they even trying to target the resistance? What exactly is the reason for their continued survival and resistance in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, you can see it if you watch the Electronic Intifada live stream. If you watch the Electronic Intifada's reports on this, my colleague John Elmer, every week on the Electronic Intifada live stream, has been very diligently covering this, been covering the fact that Palestinian resistance fighters are still fighting. Every week he gives a summary of the resistance fighters' videos, like from Hamas, from the different resistance factions. And he shows how, not only are they still fighting, they're still putting out videos showing they're fighting. and showing like just this past week as we're recording this. For example, he um, showed a video of the Soraya al Quds, which is the armed wing of Islamic Jihad, um, a video showing an attack on a guerrilla attack on an Israeli military position, and it showed footage of them in their tunnels, in the tunnels underground. You know, when they talk about the tunnel system, this is not a unitary thing, right? At the beginning, in 2023, we don't know now, but it was thought that there were as much as 500 kilometers of these tunnels. And so, even if the Israelis discover some of the tunnels, it's not just like it's not doesn't mean that the tunnels are gone. If they discover one tunnel and they collapse that tunnel, you know, that's just, you know, maybe a mile of tunnels, say, or even just say optimistically, if they collapse the tunnel, that's a kilometer of tunnel gone. This is a whole spider's network of tunnels that is underneath the Gaza Strip. You know, it's quite similar in some ways, although more technologically advanced, to what the NLF did in Vietnam, in South Vietnam, the National Liberation Forces, you know, the so-called Viet Cong, although that's actually a derisive term. But the successful liberation struggle in Vietnam, you know, they extensively relied on tunnels, and we see this the tunnel network has been incredibly successful for the Palestinian resistance in sustaining their fight against the Israeli occupiers, against the Israeli invaders in Gaza, and just simply by carrying on the fight, by keeping on fighting after 2 years, and still killing Israeli soldiers 2 years on, it is leading to a kind of collapse in the Israeli military, and they always seem to be on the edge of collapse. If you believe the Israeli press, of course, for Palestinians, that collapse can't come soon enough. But you know that is what they're saying, and they still seem to be manufacturing these weapons as well. So the homemade weapons, the sort of domestic weapons manufacturing that Palestinian resistance seems to be able to carry out. For example, the Yasin 105 rockets, RPGs, rocket propelled grenades. You know, they still seem to be able to manufacture them, and also mines, homemade mines, which they're setting up increasingly ambushes for Israeli military patrols. It has a real effect on the Israeli popular will to fight. But one of the things I've said, that I've argued, is that, you know, people talk about, is it a war, is it a genocide, and we see quite often that mainstream media, you know, portraying it as a war that is, you know, just a war that is being carried out by the Israelis, as if, you know, that it's there's kind of there's two sides just fighting each other. Whereas actually, what is really happening is that there's a genocide being carried out against the civilian population by the Israelis. That's the reality. Is the target is not Hamas. Ironically, the target is only Hamas to the extent that Hamas is the Hamas fighters are standing between the civilian population of Gaza and the Israeli military, right? But ultimately, the population of Gaza, removing the population of Gaza, is the goal, and we see it very openly now with the plans to, you know, the so-called Trump Riviera plan, to remove the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. But that's, you know, it's in a way that's nothing new, because that's what the Israelis have been saying they want to do all along. Like, and it's the whole political spectrum of Israel as well. Like at the beginning of the genocide, we saw the Israeli president Isaac Herzog, who said that oh, it's not true that there's uninvolved people in Gaza. The whole it's a whole population. So he made it very very clear that it's the whole population of Gaza. The same with the so-called defense minister at the time. There's a new defense minister now, but Yoav Gallant, October 2023, he said that we're cutting off food, water, electricity, fuel. Um, Nothing's going to be able to get in. A complete siege, and he didn't say the target was Hamas. He didn't mention Hamas. He made it very clear the whole target was the population of Gaza, and so um, Hamas is only the target to the extent that they are part of the population of the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, the population of the Gaza Strip is the target, and so this is what they're trying to do.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about this potential collapse on the Israeli side. You've done a lot of reporting on this. You had an article about a year ago about increasing suicide rates in the Israeli army, and you know, people have been talking about Israel being on the edge really since October 7th, and the political situation that Netanyahu's government hangs on by a thread. There are cases against him, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, the collapse hasn't happened yet, but there is a lot of evidence pointing in the direction that they're under a severe amount of pressure, especially given that their support in Western societies have collapsed, at least amongst the public, not amongst the politicians, but amongst the public. Polls show that there is a collapse of support for the Israeli army. And so, in your view, how could this potential collapse come about? Let's say, dream scenario, the Israelis just tap out and they give up and they decide to change course. How might that happen?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't want to be too flippant and too idealistic, but Nelson Mandela always said, always seems impossible till it's done. And Israel, I think we're going to see a very similar thing in Palestine. Like Israel is going to seem invincible until it suddenly collapses, and then we're going to see lots of think pieces. And it may not be within our lifetime. That's the brutal reality. We don't know. We don't know what's come in the future. It could be tomorrow. It could be within the next generation. But it is going to seem impossible until it suddenly happens, and we'll see. Then a lot of kind of talk about how nobody saw it coming, whereas actually we do. We did see a lot of people did see it coming. So, like, I think to answer that question, we have to look at what happened in 2000 in South Lebanon, like the sudden withdrawal of the sudden what was thought of as the sudden collapse of the Israeli military occupation in South Lebanon, and all of a sudden the Israelis essentially fled South Lebanon. There was no orderly withdrawal of their occupation from the 18-year long occupation. Their collaborators, Lebanese collaborators of the South Lebanon army, also fled with them in a really sort of disorderly way. And it seemed like a kind of miracle. But whereas actually, for people who've been paying attention, there had been a slow kind of drip drip resistance against them. Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance, fought against them and carried out a long guerrilla warfare against them, which the Israelis always downplayed. There was, censorship in the Israeli press. The Western media didn't really cover it that much or downplayed it, and the Israelis downplayed their losses. And we see a similar thing here. Whereas, every time there's deaths of Israeli soldiers, it's kind of downplayed, in the Israeli media, and there's actually military censorship of the media. And so, I think we could see a very similar thing happen in Gaza. There could be a sudden collapse of the Israeli military where um, all of a sudden they're not able to do what they want. They're not able to carry out the kind of invasions, and they're not able to carry out the kind of occupation that they want. So yeah, we'll see. I think the collapse of Israel is kind of inevitable in historic terms. It's merely a question of how many Palestinians they're going to take with them and how many people in the region they're going to take with them. And this is the real brutal reality. I think unfortunately Israel is going to become more and more um, unstable and going to become more and more violent as its end nears. And we see it's interesting because this was kind of foretold in a way by October the 7th, the military offensive by the Palestinian resistance that took place on October the 7th, 2023, in a way was kind of foretold by Israeli planners. And I've got a quote here from one of them. Um, Arnon Sofer was he's a demographer who was a close aide to the former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, and an important advisor to him, and kind of the advisor who uh, planned the withdrawal. If you remember, in 2005, there was the withdrawal, what they called the evacuation of the Israeli settlers from the Gaza Strip, and there was a strategic reasoning for that, where the idea, of course, the settlers, the ideological religious settlers, didn't want to leave Gaza, and now they are pushing to go back to Gaza. But actually, within Zionism and within the Israeli uh, planners, the Israeli military and political leadership, the reasoning was that it would be easier for them to uh, occupy Palestine as a whole from uh, outside of the Gaza Strip, and that's what they've done ever since in the last 20 years. They've kept Gaza Strip as a kind of prison camp, and so that they wouldn't have to fight in Tel Aviv, and rather that they would fight along the borders of Gaza. And the way Arnon Sofer put it was in a notorious interview with the Jerusalem Post, which is actually being deleted, but there is a copy of it online. What he said was, quote, "When 2.5 million people live in a closed-off Gaza Strip, it's going to be a human catastrophe. The pressure at the border will be awful. It's going to be a terrible war. So if we want to remain alive, this is the Israeli mentality, the Zionist mentality. If we want to remain alive, we will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day." And that's what they're doing today. That's what they're doing in Gaza. That they and it's also the mentality of why they did what they did in 2018 when there was the Great March of Return. So you know, everyone in the Western media, Western political leaders all condemn Hamas. They all condemn Palestinian resistance fighters of any form, whether they target military targets or not, or whether it's violent or non-violent. Palestinians always get condemned by Western political leaders. But when Palestinians tried non-violent resistance in 2018 with the Great March of Return to go. There was a massive popular movement which was supported by Hamas, by the Hamas government. Um, that what they did was, as you know, Ahmed, they tried to march back to their homes in what is current day Israel. There was a massive popular movement to do that, to actually hold these non-violent protests. And of course, the Israeli response to that was brutal violence, deliberate maiming by snipers, Israeli army snipers of children, often who were on these protests, marching non-violently, deliberate maiming and deliberate killing of these non-violent protesters. Snipers often shot the protesters through the head. So it's the same. It's the same mentality. It's the same strategy: kill and kill and kill every day, and that's what they're doing now. So the target, as I said before, is the civilian population.
So, Asa, you've been covering Palestine uh, for many, many years now. What has shocked you the most over the last 2 years, whether it's the actual genocide itself, the sentiment of Israeli society, or the extent to which American politicians have bent over backwards to give Israel it wants, everything that it wants. So, what exactly have you seen that has shocked you the most over the last 2 years that all your years of experience could not have prepared you for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose it hasn't really surprised me so much. I think shocked is the right word because it's the sheer brutality, but also the openness, right? I suppose that's what shocked me the most is the sheer openness of the Israeli genocide, and how it isn't really that hidden. It's hidden in the sense that Western media cover it up, help the Israelis to cover it up, but it's fairly easy to find video and evidence of what the Israelis are doing to um, to children. Deliberately targeting children, deliberately targeting every segment of Palestinian society, deliberately targeting journalists, doctors, hospitals, civilian rescue efforts. Um, it is shocking the sheer brutal violence that is being carried out, and how the mass graves of Palestinians. Um, it is shocking. It is shocking to see how they're doing it. The complicity of the Western governments as well. Again, not a surprise based on their prior logic, but it is shocking to see how um, it's not changing after 2 years. There is a very, very small change in rhetoric from, for example, the British government, um, but the actions are the same, right? They still keep carrying out their involvement in the genocide. In case of the British government, it's quite active. It's not just theoretical or you know rhetorical support for the Israelis. It's actual involvement in the genocide in the case of the British government, because the intelligence and training is the main way the British government and the British military is involved. So it is shocking to see, but it's what's interesting about it all is that yes, it's a genocide, but there's also still this guerrilla war that's happening. The Israelis are still carrying out a military campaign to try and kill the Palestinian resistance, to try and eradicate the Palestinian resistance, which is technologically far inferior. On paper, Palestinian military capability is far less technologically advanced than the Israeli military capacity, which has, of course, all this sophisticated high technology. It has nuclear weapons, of course, which it hasn't deployed as far as we know yet. A secret nuclear program of as much as 200 nuclear warheads, an undeclared nuclear program. But of course, we know because of whistleblowers and so forth that they have it. They have massive, massive, massive destructive capability, but they don't have military superiority in a quantitative sense, right? In a qualitative sense, rather. So quantitatively, in terms of its capacity on paper, they have far superior technology, but qualitatively, in terms of fighting man on man, as it were, they don't have that superiority, because they are if they did, they would have been able to uproot the Palestinian resistance by now. So we have a genocide and a war happening at the same time, and it's an asymmetric war of a superior military power on paper against a guerrilla force which is based in the population. It's a popular military force which is fighting against a uh, effectively an imperialist power, and so it's my colleague at the Electronic Intifada, Ali Abunyama, has made the observation that one of the things that is similar between Israel and Nazi Germany is that both of them um, were carrying out a genocide at the same time as losing a war. So the Nazis were losing a war. They were losing the Second World War against the Soviet Union. But at the same time, and that in that case it was secret. They were carrying out a Holocaust. They were carrying out a genocide against 6 million Jews and millions of others, and they eradicated all those people in death camps, in concentration camps, in military conflict as well. Um, so but at the same time they were losing a war. So, but they were still able to. At the same time they were losing that war, which was a more conventional military conflict with the Soviet Union. They were still able to kill millions and millions of civilians in a systematic way, and so Israel is losing a war. It's not a conventional war. It's an asymmetric war with a guerrilla force, with a guerrilla resistance force. It seems to be losing that war because for a guerrilla force to win, it's the same with every guerrilla conflict in history. You look at them, the NLF in Vietnam, and also the National Liberation Forces in Algeria. Militarily, they didn't. You don't win on the battlefield as a guerrilla force, right? Everyone talks about the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in the 60s, right? But actually, if you look at what happened on the battlefield, it was a loss. It was a loss for the so-called Viet Cong, the National Liberation Forces in South Vietnam. It was a loss for them. The Americans overcame on the battlefield on the day, but it was still a turning point for the Americans, which was a major factor, which led to their withdrawal from Vietnam. And so that is what asymmetric war is. It's a long term grinding thing, which seems like it's getting nowhere on one level, right? But all of a sudden there'll be this miraculous transformation, and that's what we saw in Lebanon, and that's what we saw in Vietnam, and that's what we saw in Algeria, and so it will seem impossible till it happens in Palestine. And I think eventually that is going to be what happens. But at the same time as this war is being fought in Gaza, this asymmetrical guerrilla war, there is a genocide against the civilian population that is being carried out. And so the Palestinian resistance fighters can slow down that genocide. And I think that is the answer to the question. You see this kind of propaganda line by the Israelis and by Zionists that is sort of put out sometimes about how, oh well, it can't be a genocide because we would have killed them all by now if we'd wanted to. But the reality is that the Palestinian resistance is stopping that from happening, right? You see these Trump Riviera plans about clearing out Gaza and rebuilding it into some kind of new Dubai. There's one kind of spanner in that works, which is Palestinian resistance fighters are not going to go quietly. According to some estimates, Palestinian resistance fighters, the number of actual uh, 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 soldiers or commanders, guerrillas, whatever you want to call them. Of course, the Israelis call them terrorists. Is the number is back up to the same number that it was on October 2023, according to some estimates. We don't know. Obviously, this is a secretive underground, guerrilla force, so we don't know for sure. But according to some estimates, it is around 40,000 fighters, which is the same level that there was in October 2023. And the reason for that is because of recruitment, because the population broadly supports them, and so they're able to replenish their ranks, even though thousands of them have also been killed as well, most likely.
So you mentioned how Nazi Germany was losing a war while committing this genocide, and you've talked about how Israel, was exhausted with the occupation of southern Lebanon and was forced to withdraw suddenly. One thing that is happening now, obviously, is this genocide in Gaza that they're struggling to carry out. They're trying to occupy Gaza fully and kill or cleanse the population entirely. But they do also currently find themselves still sort of stuck in southern Lebanon. They have these hilltops that they refuse to let go of. They're starting to occupy Syria now. Syria has decided to not resist, but that could potentially change if push comes to shove. Uh, I'm not suggesting there is any evidence that the new government is interested in resisting, but even critics like or supporters, sorry, of the current government, like Abdel Karim, this African American who's been like embedded in Idlib and many other parts. Even he is now starting to criticize the government and say they have to start resisting Israel. And so, despite the attempts by the new Syrian government to try to cozy up to Israel and prove that they can be this, peaceful ally on their border, that isn't really working out. And so there's the potential for greater chaos in Syria. But more importantly, and obviously the Houthis are doing what they're doing from Yemen, but looming is another round of war with Iran. And that could potentially be very destructive for Israel. As we saw in the first round, it was incredibly destructive. The Israeli and
Yeah,
Western media tried to cover this up. So,
yeah,
what is your assessment potentially of another round of warfare with Iran? And what did you make of the first round that they had with each other?
yeah. I mean, I think the Israelis. It's quite interesting. I was just before I came onto this, I was just watching a Grey Zone, a recent, well, it's from a few weeks ago now, a couple of weeks ago, Grey Zone live stream. And one of the people talking on that was the Grey Zone journalist Jeremy Lafredo, who was, of course, detained by the Israelis during that the 12-day war between Iran and Israel. And he was detained because, as they accused him of revealing secrets to an enemy in wartime, and that was what they claimed was, showing where the Iranian rockets had actually hit. And they were. It was quite interesting during that war because at the beginning there was a very few small number of international media who were in occupied Palestine, present day Israel, and they one or two of them, I remember at the beginning, one or two of them did actually show damage to areas that were hit by the Iranian missiles, and it showed that these were military targets essentially, and it was very, 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 very quickly the Israeli military censorship clamped down on that, and that was something we saw as well during the 2006 war with Lebanon, when Hezbollah was hitting targets inside northern occupied Palestine, present day Israel. Um, the journalist Jonathan Cook has talked about this and has reported about this because he was actually living in Nazareth in northern occupied Palestine at the time, and he had to tread a very fine line between defying the military censorship, which would have got him arrested, and also reporting the truth, which was broadly that Hezbollah was the Lebanese resistance movement was targeting military and structural economic targets, um, Israeli targets, and so it was quite interesting how the uh, Israeli military clamped down on that and to try and stop wider awareness globally of the fact that Iran was quite successfully, it seems, targeting these military targets. And I think that it's because that was covered up. We don't know the full extent of the damage, but I think it was. I mean, I have a suspicion that it was far more extensive than they let on, and that that was why the war came between Iran and Israel came to a relatively quick conclusion. And, I think you're right. This is a major factor for the Israelis to calculate, is the fact that if they go too far with the Greater Israel plans, as they're now openly calling it, Netanyahu has now the concept of Greater Israel is sometimes seen as like a conspiracy theory, but Netanyahu has confirmed on Israeli TV now that that is what he's sympathetic with. Um, of course, Greater Israel. The idea is it's vague, but it's based on a kind of biblical allusion of from the Nile to the Euphrates. So that would encompass everything from Egypt, Palestine, Jordan, parts of Saudi Arabia, parts of Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, even as far as Iraq in a maximalist vision, and that is has always been a part of the Zionist vision. If you look at the logo of the Irgun was one of the Jewish terrorist organizations which carried out attacks against Palestinian civilians and British soldiers in occupied Palestine in the pre-state era, and the Irgun was one of the Jewish terrorist groups, which were the forerunners of the modern day Israeli army. If you look at their logo, it shows what they call the two banks to the Jordan. It's all of modern day Palestine and all of modern day Jordan. So and they have a song in which is still part of the that sort of revisionist Zionist, right wing Zionist, Likud Zionist position, which is two banks to the Jordan. This one is ours, and that one is too. So they're laying claim to both banks of the Jordan, and that's always been part of the Zionist vision, So the concept of Greater Israel has always been part of Israeli expansionism. It's just a question of how much they can actually make a reality on the ground, and it's not necessarily they're not necessarily able to do that.
So, Asa, could you tell us a little bit about your book? Uh, it, it's a bestseller, Weaponizing Anti-Semitism. I believe you were covering the campaign to get Jeremy Corbyn essentially ousted from British politics. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Yes, you're right. It's weapon. It's the full title is "Weaponizing Anti-Semitism: How the Israel Lobby Brought Down Jeremy Corbyn." And Jeremy Corbyn, of course, is a sort of for American viewers, is a kind of Bernie Sanders, Jean-Luc Mélenchon for French viewers, kind of figure. So he was in the Labour Party, the Labour Party being kind of similar to the Democratic Party in the US. It's kind of center left. Used to describe itself as socialist party, but became increasingly right wing over the decades. But Jeremy Corbyn was always on the left of that party. And in 2015, through a kind of combination of good luck and fluke and bad planning by the Labour Party establishment, he became, and also of popular support was a major factor as well. He became leader of the Labour Party. He was elected in a kind of primary equivalent to a primary election. Became leader of the Labour Party, and it was never really meant to happen. And so and he stood for very popular policies, right, like renationalizing institutions in British life, like the public transport service, reversing the slow privatization that's been happening in our National Health Service, um, popular policies like that used to be very mainstream before the neoliberal era of the Thatcher Reagan era. But also crucially, he was an anti-war activist and most notably a Palestine solidarity activist. And so because of that, he became a real target and a real lightning rod, not only of the Labour Party establishment, which was incredibly right wing, but of all the media, all of the corporate media, all of the mainstream media, the entire spectrum from right wing to liberal, and especially the liberal media, the Guardian and the BBC were very, very anti Jeremy Corbyn. And also crucially, and this is what my book focuses on, is the state of Israel and the pro-Israel lobby. The act, and I do mean the actual state of Israel, not just the pro-Israel lobby. There was a campaign by the Israeli embassy and its agents in Britain to oust Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, to divide the movement, the popular movement that really backed him, that formed to try and get him into power. And the pro-Israel lobby, the state of Israel, and its allies in Britain, and its de facto allies like the Labour Party establishment and the mainstream media, all colluded to successfully prevent Jeremy Corbyn from being elected Prime Minister of Britain. And they were successful in that. And they were also successful in ultimately ousting Corbyn from the Labour Party in 2020. And so that was a kind of shock and awe. And since then, the 5 years since Jeremy Corbyn was ousted from the Labour Party, he's kind of prevaricated about whether or not to start a new political party. And he just announced recently that he will be doing that with well, it was actually announced by his ally Zara Sultana, a younger similar leader, who also a Labour Party, a former Labour Party MP. She quit the Labour Party dramatically in July, and she announced that she'd be co-leading the foundation of a new party with Jeremy Corbyn. And so, unfortunately, I might have to write a volume 2 about similar things happening. So, but we'll see. We'll see about that.
Well, Asa, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss these events. Could you share with us, do you have anywhere you'd like to point the audience to check out more of your work?
Yeah. So, I mean, I did most of the reporting that my book is based on for the Electronic Intifada, and my reporting about Gaza, my reporting about the Israelis, the article that you mentioned about the uh, reportedly impending collapse of the Israeli military and increasing suicides in the Israeli military. Reporting that I've done about the Hannibal Directive, of course, which I know you've covered quite a lot as well. You've done a really good job of, about how the Israeli military killed Israelis on October 7th due to the Hannibal Directive. All of that kind of reporting has all been done for the Electronic Intifada. And I also have a Substack, asawinstanley.substack.com, which I put all my journalism there. I release all my journalism there, and my podcast appearances. So I'm sure I'll be putting this up there as well.
Wonderful. I'll have that information in the description of this video for the audience, and I'll display it on the screen as well. Asa, thank you so much for your time, and I hope we can do this again.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Trust nothing.